We're going to be looking this morning at what that passage from Joshua has to teach us about, firstly, God's mercy, secondly, our faith, and thirdly, God's encouragement. There'll be some of you who, as we're going through this series on Joshua, will be feeling that we're not really addressing the main issue. Because the background to the book of Joshua is not just about a man having been trained to lead God's people. It's also about a mission that has been given to the people of God. Deuteronomy chapter 7 puts it fairly clearly. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are about to enter and occupy, and clears away many nations before you, when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must utterly destroy them, make no covenant with them, and show them no mercy. And this is what Joshua and the people proceeded to do. Joshua chapter 11 verse 11 is particularly graphic. And they put to the sword all who were in Hatzor, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed. Many people have said that this describes a horrific ethnic cleansing. And so how can we possibly look to the Old Testament for moral guidance? This is not a new issue. Those led by Richard Dawkins may be shouting about it loudly today. But from my earliest days as a Christian, 40 years ago, this is something I've been aware of and sought to understand. It's not an issue that's going to go away. And we can't afford to just run away from it saying, oh well, that was the Old Testament. The Bible is very clear. It's the same God, Old and New Testament. And there's plenty in the New Testament that shows God acting in judgment. Judgment that many people will see as harsh. Abraham said, will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? Sadly, there are many believers who seem to question that and are tempted to invent a different God from the God of the Bible. There are real questions, and we will be looking at them later in the series, but I raise them now just to let you know we'll not be avoiding them, and also because it's an important issue to have in mind as we examine this morning this first story that the book of Joshua presents us with. As we look at the story of Rahab, what sort of picture do you get? Do you see an angry God who is just determined at all costs to wipe out the nations who live in the land that he's decided to give to the Israelites? Well, as you've just heard in our reading, that story of Rahab is firstly a story of God's mercy. Rahab was a Gentile, not part of God's chosen people. She was an Amorite, one of the people groups that God had said should be wiped out from the land, and she was a prostitute. It's hardly a promising situation, is it? And yet we see God at work in her life. If you wanted to be awkward, you could say, but what does God do for her? After all, the sending of spies was a perfectly natural thing to do. A prostitute's house would be a good place to go. There'd be nothing unusual about strangers being there. And well, the two spies, they were in a very tricky situation when the king's men came hunting for them. So they simply had to cut a deal with her in order to escape with their lives. As the spies say, our life for yours. If you do not tell this business of ours, then we will deal kindly and faithfully with you when the Lord gives us the land. And so you might say this deal sparing Rahab has simply been the natural outworking of Joshua sending spies in. Nothing to do with God. But I think the whole way this story is told invites us to think that perhaps God has been behind these events. And so often what might be taken as coincidences are actually God at work. We have an even stronger indication of this if we jump forward in the story. First of all, let's do a little jump to chapter 6, where the walls of Jericho come tumbling down. Joshua tells the 2 spies to make sure that Rahab and all who belong to her, her kindred, they're all kept safe. Now, we'll see in this series that Joshua is very good at obeying God's commands. As we heard previously, he was told not to depart from them, either to the left or the right. Why then does he not tell the 2 spies, you can't possibly have made a bargain with this Amorite prostitute. I've given my word to the Lord to obey his command to destroy all this people. I'm sorry, but if anyone's oath is going to be broken, it will have to be yours. I'm not disobeying a direct command from God. And yet Joshua doesn't say this. Why not? Perhaps because he knows that God is not simply a God of justice, but a God of mercy. And he can see the Lord's hand in this. Skip forward even further, and you find that at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, Rahab is quite a star in the genealogy of Jesus. She's one of only 4 women who are named. She's so accepted into God's people that she marries an important man from the tribe of Judah, and she becomes the great-great-grandmother of King David. Surely there could be no greater sign of God's acceptance and mercy. That a foreign prostitute should play such a part in God's purposes is a wonderful reminder that he can use the likes of even you and me. As Paul writes to the church at Corinth, consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. You too have been saved by God's mercy for a purpose. So this story, firstly, should remind us of God's mercy. Secondly, it should also make us think of Rahab's faith. Her faith is commended in the New Testament, both in the books of James and Hebrews. What was the faith she showed? Well, Rahab had heard about God's mighty acts, how he parted the Red Sea, and of the victory in battle that God had given Israel over Sihon and Og, 2 Amorite kings. And she tells the spies, our hearts failed and courage left us. That's all very well. But the people of Jericho did not give themselves up to the Lord. They did not surrender. They did not turn from their gods and ask the true God for mercy. No, they shut themselves inside their strong walls, trusting in their own king and army to keep them safe. So, whilst they sort of knew that the God of Israel was mightier than their gods, yet they still did not put their trust in him. This sort of divided thinking is, I fear, commonplace today. There is some sort of belief in a mighty God, some sort of belief in the Saviour Jesus, and yet people continue to place their trust in their own efforts. We say that our help will come through advances in science, economic prosperity. We will put our trusts in pension schemes and high walls. And although we may sing the odd hymn to God, actively we do not trust him for much. We have a vague hope that there might be a ticket to heaven, so we don't want to abandon him altogether. But as far as day-to-day life is concerned, well, there are better things to trust in. Rahab came to a crunch moment. when she had to choose who she would put her trust in? Would she trust in the God she'd heard so much about, or would she stick together with everyone else and trust the army and walls? It can't have been easy for Rahab to disobey the king's men and to deliberately deceive them. She was standing against her whole culture. In one of my commentaries, Rahab was likened to Athanasius, an important 4th century theologian and bishop. He didn't have an easy life. For much of his life he seemed alone. Emperors denounced him. They frequently sent him into exile. He was actually exiled from his bishopric 5 times. On one occasion the story goes that someone came to him and said, "Athanasius, the whole world is against you." And his reply was, "Then is Athanasius against the world." Talk about standing against the tide. And today in our culture, God is calling Christians to stand against the tide, and many of us are going AWOL, absent without leave. Faith is such a key issue. Faith involves being willing to take action. Rahab hid the spies from the king and sent the king's men on a wild goose chase. And that's what the story of Joshua shows time and time again. Faith leading to action. And it's why I think it's a good book for us to be studying. We've looked at God's mercy, we've looked at faith, and thirdly we look at encouragement. Faith does at times mean trusting God and obeying him when it's hard, and the way ahead seems dark, worrying, uncertain. But this story from Joshua reminds us that God doesn't leave us on our own as we struggle to live out our faith. He sends us encouragement. And that encouragement can come in so many different ways. So let's see in our story the generous encouragement that God gives to Joshua. You might have felt that given all the assurance that God gave to Joshua, all the things that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, you might think, it's a bit rich of Joshua to send spies into Jericho. I mean, so what more does he need? God's told him. God's reassured him that the battle is his. Just get on with it, Joshua. But the story doesn't hint that Joshua did the wrong thing in sending in the spies. At the time, Joshua didn't know that God was going to flatten the walls of Jericho. Joshua was correctly doing his best to sort out the right way to win this battle. And part of this was to understand the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. Faith doesn't mean that we're gung-ho in our attitudes, or that we should not be giving of our very best efforts. But Joshua, he must have been overwhelmed by the news he received from the spies, the news that their enemies' hearts have failed, that there's no courage left. What a tremendous encouragement. I'm sure it's no coincidence that the spies heard that message. Just as in the book of Judges, when Gideon had already received 2 miraculous signs that God was with him, God still encouraged Gideon to go into the enemy camp to spy out their mood and strength. And Gideon heard an enemy soldier telling of a dream in which God had given their army into the hands of Gideon. Our God is an encouraging God. And that's brilliant news. Because which one of us does not need encouragement? But where does that encouragement come from? Well, a lot of that encouragement comes through reading the Bible, of what God has done. It should also come from us sharing with one another the stories of what God has done for us. And I hope and pray that goes on in the home groups in our church, and at other occasions too, like during coffee after church. I'd also love it if people were willing to share their stories with all of us on a Sunday during the service. May God help us in this whole area of encouragement. And may we have a faith that leads to action. And may we stand for God against the tide. May our faith our love for him be like Rahab's, something that pleases God. And may we rejoice in the fact that God has mercy on people like Rahab and people like you and me, and makes us a part of his royal family. Amen.